By this Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey gave up all non-Turkish territory except Kurdistan, losing Arabia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, western Thrace, and some islands of the Aegean. The capitulations were abolished in return for a promise of judicial reform. There were no reparations and no disarmament, except for that the straits were demilitarized and were to be open to all ships except those of belligerents if Turkey was at war. Turkey accepted a minorities treaty and agreed to a compulsory exchange with Greece of Greek and Turkish minorities, judged on the basis of membership in the Greek Orthodox Church or Muslim religions. Under this last provision, over 1,250,000 Greeks were removed from Turkey by 1930. Unfortunately, most of these had been urban shopkeepers in Turkey and were settled as farmers on the unhospitable soil of Macedonia. The Bulgarian peasants who had previously lived in Macedonia were unceremoniously dumped into Bulgaria, where they were tinder for the sparks of a revolutionary secret society of Bulgaria called the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO, whose chief method of political action was assassination. As a result of the rising tide of aggression in the 1930s, the clause regarding the demilitarization of the Straits was revoked at the Montreux Convention of July 1936. This gave Turkey full sovereignty over the Straits, including the right to fortify them. All the original peace treaties consisted of 5 chief parts: A. The Covenant of the League of Nations, B. The territorial provisions, C. The disarmament provision, and D. The reparations provisions, and E. Penalties and guarantees. The first of these must be reserved until later, but the others should be mentioned here. In theory, the territorial provisions of the treaties were based on self-determination, but in fact they were usually based on other considerations: strategic, economic, punitive, legal, power, or compensation. By self-determination, the peacemakers usually meant nationality, and by nationality they usually meant language, except in the Ottoman Empire, where nationality usually meant religion. The 6 cases where self-determination, that is plebiscites, were actually used show that the peoples of these areas were not so nationalistic as the peacemakers believed, because in Allenstein, where Polish-speaking people were 40% of the population, only 2% voted to join Poland. The area was returned to Germany. In Upper Silesia, where the comparable figures were 65% and 40%, the area was split, the more industrial eastern portion going to Poland, while the more rural western part was returned to Germany. In Klagenfurt, where Slovene speakers formed 68% of the population, only 40% wanted to join Yugoslavia, so the area was left in Austria. Somewhat similar results occurred in Marienwerder, but not in northern Schleswig, which voted to join Denmark. In each case, the voters, probably for economic reasons, chose to join the economically more prosperous state rather than the one sharing the same language. In addition to the areas mentioned, Germany had to return Alsace and Lorraine to France, give 3 small districts to Belgium, and abandon the northern edge of East Prussia around Memel to the Allied powers. This last area was given to the new state of Lithuania in 1924 by the Conference of Ambassadors. The chief territorial disputes arose over the Polish corridor, the Rhineland and the Saar. The 14 points had promised to establish an independent Poland with access to the Baltic Sea. It had been French policy since about 1500 to oppose any strong state in Central Europe by seeking allies in Eastern Europe. With the collapse of Russia in 1917, the French sought a substitute ally in Poland. Accordingly, Foch wanted to give all of East Prussia to Poland. Instead, the experts, who were very pro-Polish, gave Poland access to the sea by severing East Prussia from the rest of Germany by creating a Polish corridor in the valley of the Vistula. Most of the area was Polish-speaking, and German commerce with East Prussia was largely by sea. However, the city of Danzig, at the mouth of the Vistula, was clearly a German city. Lloyd George refused to give it to Poland. Instead, it was made a free city under the protection of the League of Nations. The French wished to detach the whole of Germany west of the Rhine, the so-called Rhineland, to create a separate state and increase French security against Germany. They gave up their separatist agitation in return for Wilson's promise of March 14, 1919, to give a joint Anglo-American guarantee against a German attack. This promise was signed in treaty form on June 28, 1919, but fell through when the United States Senate did not ratify the agreement. Since Clemenceau had been able to persuade Foch and Poincaré to accept the Rhine settlement only because of this guarantee, its failure to materialize ended his political career. The Rhineland settlement, as it stood, had two quite separate provisions. On the one hand, Rhineland and three bridgeheads on the right bank of the Rhine were to be occupied by Allied troops for from 5 to 15 years. On the other hand, the Rhineland and a zone 50 kilometers wide along the right bank were to be permanently demilitarized, and any violation of this could be regarded as a hostile act by the signers of the treaty. This meant that any German troops or fortifications were excluded from this area forever. This was the most important clause of the Treaty of Versailles. This is in cursive letters. So long as it remained in effect, the great industrial region of the Ruhr, on the right bank of the Rhine, the economic backbone of Germany's ability to wage warfare, was exposed to a quick French military thrust from the west, and Germany could not threaten France or move eastward against Czechoslovakia or Poland if France objected. Of these two clauses, the military occupation of Rhineland and the bridgeheads was ended in 1930, 5 years ahead of schedule. This made it possible for Hitler to destroy the second provision, the demilitarization of Western Germany, by remilitarizing the area in March 1936. The last disputed territorial change of the Treaty of Versailles was concerned with the Saar base, rich in industry and coal. Although its population was clearly German, the French claimed most of it in 1919 on the grounds that two-thirds of it had been inside the French frontiers of 1814, and that they should obtain the coal mines as compensation for the French mines destroyed by the Germans in 1918. They did get the mines, but the area was separated politically from both countries to be ruled by the League of Nations for 15 years, and then given a plebiscite. When the plebiscite was held in 1935 after an admirable League administration, only about 2,000 out of about 528,000 voted to join France, while about 90% wished to join Germany, the remainder indicating their desire to continue under League rule. The Germans, as a result of this vote, agreed to buy back the coal mines from France for 900 million francs payable in coal over a 5-year period. The territorial provisions of the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon were such as to destroy completely the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was reduced from 115,000 square miles with 30 million inhabitants to 32,000 square miles with 6.5 million inhabitants. To Czechoslovakia went Bohemia, Moravia, parts of Lower Austria, and Austrian Silesia. To Yugoslavia went Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Dalmatia. To Romania went Bukovina. To Italy went South Tyrol, Trentino, Istria, and an extensive area north of the Adriatic, including Trieste. The Treaty of Trianon reduced Hungary from 125,000 square miles with 21 million inhabitants to 35,000 square miles with 8 million inhabitants. To Czechoslovakia went Slovakia and Ruthenia. To Romania went Transylvania, part of the Hungarian Plain, and most of the Banat. To Yugoslavia went the rest of the Banat, Croatia, Slavonia, and some other districts. The treaties of peace set the boundaries of the defeated states, but not those of the new state. These latter were fixed by a number of treaties made in the years following 1918. The process led to disputes and even to violent clashes of arms, and some issues are still subjects of discord to the present time. The most violent controversies arose in regard to the boundaries of Poland. Of these, only that with Germany was set by the Treaty of Versailles. The Poles refused to accept that their other frontiers as suggested by the Allies at Paris, and by 1920 were at war with Lithuania over Vilna, with Russia over the eastern border, with Ukrainians over Galicia, and with Czechoslovakia over Teschen. The struggle over Vilna began in 1919 when the Poles took the district from the Russians, but soon lost it again. The Russians yielded it to the Lithuanians in 1920, and this was accepted by Poland, but within 3 months of it was seized by Polish freebooters. A plebiscite ordered by the League of Nations was held in January 1922 under Polish control and gave a Polish majority. The Lithuanians refused to accept the validity of this vote or a decision of the Conference of Ambassadors of March 1923 giving the area to Poland. Instead, Lithuania continued to consider itself at war with Poland until December 1927. Poland did not fare so well at the other end of its frontier. There, fighting broke out between Czech and Polish forces over Teschen in January 1919. The Conference of Ambassadors divided the area between the two claimants, but gave the valuable coal mines to Czechoslovakia, July 1920. Poland's eastern frontier was settled only after a bloody war with the Soviet Union. The Supreme Council, in December 1919, had laid down the so-called Curzon Line as the eastern boundary of Polish administration, but within 6 months the Polish armies had crossed this and advanced beyond Kiev. A Russian counterattack soon drove the Poles back, and Polish territory was invaded in its turn. The Poles appealed in panic to the Supreme Council, which was reluctant to intervene. The French, however, did not hesitate and sent General Weygand with supplies to defend Warsaw. The Russian offensive was broken on the Vistula, and peace negotiations began. The final settlement, signed at Riga in March 1921, gave Poland a frontier 150 miles further east than the Curzon Line and brought into Poland many non-Polish peoples, including 1 million White Russians and 4 million Ukrainians. Romania also had a dispute with Russia arising from the Romanian occupation of Bessarabia in 1918. In October 1920, the Conference of Ambassadors recognized Bessarabia as part of Romania. Russia protested, and the United States refused to accept the transfer. In view of these disturbances, Poland and Romania signed a defensive alliance against Russia in March 1921. The most important dispute of this kind arose over the disposition of Fiume. This problem was acute because one of the great powers was involved. The Italians had yielded Fiume to Yugoslavia in the Treaty of London of 1915 and had promised in November 1918 to draw the Italian-Yugoslav boundary on lines of nationality. Thus they had little claim to Fiume. Nevertheless, at Paris, they insisted on it for political and economic reasons. Having just excluded the Habsburg Empire from the Adriatic Sea, and not wishing to see any new power rise in its place, they did all they could to hamper Yugoslavia and to curtail its access to the Adriatic. Moreover, the Italian acquisition of Trieste gave them a great seaport with no future, since it was separated by a political boundary from the hinterland where it could draw its trade. To protect Trieste, Italy wanted to control all the possible competing ports in the area. The city of Fiume itself was largely Italian, but the suburbs and surrounding countryside were overwhelmingly Slav. The experts at Paris wished to give Italy neither Fiume nor Dalmatia, but Colonel House tried to, this is the assistant to the genius Wilson, tried to overrule the experts in order to obtain Italian support for the League of Nations in return. Wilson overruled House and issued his famous appeal to the Italian people, which resulted in the temporary withdrawal of the Italian delegation from Paris. After their return, the issue was left unsettled. In September 1919, an erratic Italian poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, with a band of freebooters, seized Fiume and set up an independent government on a comic opera basis. The dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia continued with decreasing bitterness until November 1920, when they signed a treaty at Rapallo, dividing the area but leaving Fiume itself a free city. This settlement was not satisfactory. A group of fascists from Italy, where this party was not yet in office, seized the city in March 1922 and were removed by the Italian army 3 weeks later. The problem was finally settled by the Treaty of Rome of January 1924, by which Fiume was granted to Italy, but the suburb of Port Barras and a 50-year lease on one of the 3 harbour basins went to Yugoslavia. Port Barras, what kind of suburb of Rijeka is that? These territorial disputes are of importance because they continued to lacerate relationships between neighboring states until well into the period of World War II and even later. The names of Fiume, Thrace, Bessarabia, Epirus, Transylvania, Mamel, Vilna, Teschen, Zard, Danzig, and Macedonia were still echoing as battle cries of overheated nationalists 20 years after the peace conference assembled at Paris. The work of that conference had undoubtedly reduced the numbers of minority peoples, but this had only served to increase the intensity of feeling of the minorities remaining. The numbers of these remained large. There were over 1 million Germans in Poland, 550,000 in Hungary, 3,100,000 in Czechoslovakia, about 700,000 in Romania, 500,000 in Yugoslavia, and 250,000 in Italy. There were 450,000 Magyars in Yugoslavia, 750,000 in Czechoslovakia, and about 1,500,000 in Romania. There were about 5 million White Russians and Ukrainians in Poland, and about 1,100,000 of these in Romania. To protect these minorities, the Allied and associated powers forced the new states of Central and Eastern Europe to sign minority treaties by which these minorities were granted a certain minimum of cultural and political rights. These treaties were guaranteed by the League of Nations, but there was no power to enforce observation of their terms. The most that could be done was to issue a public reprimand against the offending government, as was done more than once, for example, against Poland. The disarmament provisions of the peace treaties were much easier to draw up than to enforce. It was clearly understood that the disarmament of the defeated powers was but the first step toward the general disarmament of the victor nations as well. In the case of the Germans, this connection was explicitly made in the treaty so that it was necessary, in order to keep Germany legally disarmed, for the other signers of the treaty to work constantly toward general disarmament again after 1919, lest the Germans claim that they were no longer bound to remain disarmed.